Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Daniel Miller about when and why ignorance functions as an excuse from blameworthiness, and how this is related to a phenomenon called tracing.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Daniel Miller, who's visiting assistant professor of philosophy at West Virginia University. Dan earned his PhD from Florida State University, where he wrote a dissertation on blameworthiness and ignorance. He's published several articles on issues related to blame, including some very cool papers co-authored with Kyle Fritz on hypocrisy and the standing to blame. But he's also published some papers which focus on when ignorance can be a legitimate excuse from blame, and this will be the focus in today's episode. So welcome to the show, Dan. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will?
Yeah, thank you both so much for having me on. I love that you guys are doing this show. I'm a big fan, and so I'm excited to be here.
Nice.
Yeah, so as you said, I'm a visiting assistant professor at West Virginia University. I write on questions related to responsibility, blame, and more recently, forgiveness. One of the central focuses of my research, as you mentioned, is the topic of blameworthiness and ignorance. So when does ignorance constitute an excuse for morally wrong behavior or its outcomes? And when it does, why is that? Furthermore, when is an agent blameworthy or blameless for ignorance itself? And so these are some questions I imagine we'll get into in some more detail in a little bit. I also have recently written a couple of papers in which I address a problem of moral luck that arises for people whose agency depends in large part upon the use of brain-computer interfaces. And in addition to questions concerning when agents are responsible and blameworthy, I'm also interested in questions about how we ought to respond to agents who are blameworthy. So, right, even if an agent's blameworthy for something, it's an open question whether, for example, I have the moral standing or the right to blame them or to forgive them. Mm-hmm. And so, as you've mentioned, I've written some papers on hypocrisy and moral standing with my friend and co-author Kyle Fritz. And we've recently written a paper on an interesting asymmetry between the standing to blame and the standing to forgive that's forthcoming in ethics. So, like some of your previous guests, I was initially drawn to the topic of free will because of a very familiar concern with reconciling divine foreknowledge and free will. And I can even remember when I was really young, I had some rudimentary grasp on this problem. I can remember, trying to fake out God by trying to do or think something really spontaneously, which of course, I realize is pointless, but it seemed, I couldn't resist the drive to do that. In any case, my interest in free will really took shape when I took an undergraduate course at William Patterson University with Ben Vilhauer. He's a philosopher who actually writes on free will skepticism. It was in that course that Ben introduced me to the debate over the compatibility of causal determinism and free will, the debate over the principle of alternate possibilities, concerns about ultimacy, free will skepticism, and so on. So I'm really indebted to Ben on drawing me into the contemporary literature on these topics. I then went to grad school at Florida State, which was a wonderful fit for my interests. And of course, that's where I was able to study with Randy Clark, Al Mealy, Michael McKenna, all of whom had a role in shaping my interests and positions on agency and responsibility. I'm, of course, particularly grateful to my advisor, Randy Clark, whom I deeply admire and whom I'm indebted to in many ways. So when I was trying to decide on a topic to write my dissertation on, I had a number of different topics I was interested in. I was actually going to write a dissertation on sort of selected topics in moral responsibility. So I was going to write a chapter on manipulation and responsibility, the historical condition on responsibility, epistemic condition on responsibility. And so I presented these ideas to Randy, and he responded, quite rightly. He said, "Look, those aren't 5 chapters; those are 5 dissertations." He said, "Pick one of them." It was Randy that suggested that I write on the epistemic condition. Not least of all because it just hasn't been covered nearly as much as the control condition on responsibility on free will. So that's how I got to working on this topic in particular.
Yeah, very cool. Well, as our listeners know, this podcast is all about free will. But a lot of people care about free will because of its connection to moral responsibility. It's common to treat free will as the control condition, like you just mentioned earlier about people focusing on control. It seems that in addition to this control condition, there's also this epistemic condition on moral responsibility that you also mentioned. And it seems like ignorance can be a legitimate excuse. So could you first start by saying a bit about when ignorance excuses and when it doesn't?
Yeah, so there are a number of sub-questions and debates that fall under the heading of, the so-called epistemic condition. Questions about the awareness or the knowledge someone needs in order to be responsible or blameworthy for something. And I think it's just worth saying at the outset that I just can't do them all justice here, right? So there are going to be those who are familiar with the literature that might notice that I'm skirting over certain debates in order to focus on other topics. And who knows? Maybe you'll have some other authors come on to discuss some of them, and maybe they'll plug up the gaps that I leave behind. Um, but okay, so oftentimes the answer to this question of when ignorance excuses is motivated by beginning with a case. So I like to use a case that's offered by Gideon Rosen. So suppose that I'm making you a cup of tea, and I put arsenic into your tea while mistakenly believing that it's sugar. So am I responsible? In this case, am I blameworthy for effectively poisoning you? And so, well, it depends upon why I'm ignorant of the fact that what I put into your tea is arsenic and not sugar. So suppose first that I'm ignorant in this case because someone else has, unbeknownst to me, secretly swapped my arsenic and sugar jars. Well, then it seems like I'm off the hook. But suppose instead that I'm...
Wait a minute. Can I interrupt here? You have an arsenic jar?
Oh, yeah. Well, doesn't everyone keep an arsenic jar? So,
Sorry.
Matt's the one who's going to come in and swap them.
Yes. Well, I would expect nothing less of Matt. Good that I know you two, keep you away from my sugar and arsenic jars. Right, if Matt swapped the jars, unbeknownst to me, and I had no reason to think Matt was sneaking around. Maybe I should know better, but then it seems like I'm off the hook. But suppose that instead I'm ignorant because I just keep my arsenic and sugar jars in the same cabinet, right? I just can't be bothered. I'm just too lazy to label them, right? In that case, it seems like I'm blameworthy for poisoning you. Okay, so what's this supposed to show? Right? It seems like the difference between these two variations on the arsenic case is that in the first one, I'm blameless for my ignorance. And in the second variation, my ignorance is culpable. I'm blameworthy for being ignorant in that case. And so this suggests a principle that's accepted in at least one form or another by almost everyone writing on the topic. That principle is that an agent is blameworthy for acting from ignorance only if the agent is blameworthy for the ignorance from which they act. And so if that principle is right, then blameless ignorance provides an excuse for wrongdoing, and ignorance that is blameworthy or culpable doesn't. And so that's why I call that the blameless ignorance principle.
Nice. Okay, so ignorance excuses when it's blameless. Now, could you say a little bit more about some of the accounts on offer about why ignorance excuses when it does?
Yeah, so there are at least two very general positions on why blameless ignorance excuses. So the first position is based on what an agent has the ability and perhaps also the opportunity to do or to avoid. And so there are a number of different ways one might develop or articulate this sort of view. So I'll just present the general idea roughly like this. An agent is blameworthy for something, whether it's wrongdoing or even someone's ignorance itself, only if it's reasonable to expect that agent to have avoided that thing. And so, what's reasonable to expect of an agent might depend upon their cognitive capacities, their own beliefs, their cultural setting, and so on. And so we could just call this, or, views that take this sort of approach, the reasonable expectation view. So we can think about a case to illustrate it. So think about an ancient slaveholder who's ignorant that his slaveholding is morally wrong. So one needn't downplay the evil of slavery to think that given the widespread, perhaps ubiquitous acceptance of slavery in his cultural setting, that it would be unreasonable to expect him to realize that what he does is wrong. Right? We might even plausibly suppose that his own beliefs and his historical and cultural setting are such that they just reinforce his own ignorance on this matter. And so one reason to think this is that it seems unlikely that the slaveholder would have any opportunities to realize that he's mistaken. Right? So what are the chances that he suffers a crisis of conscience? He comes to reflect upon his own beliefs and actions and realizes that slavery is wrong. Could he even find a dissenting opinion among anyone that he knows? Right? We can suppose, there weren't, troops of ancient abolitionist traveling from town to town protesting slavery, right, in a way that would make him think twice about what he does. And so even, given his own framework of beliefs, would he even be able to see any reason to question his slaveholding to begin with, right? And so if the answers to these sorts of questions are no, which I think seems plausible, then it doesn't seem that it would be reasonable to expect him to avoid his own ignorance that slavery is wrong. And so on this view, on this reasonable expectation view, if it's unreasonable to expect him to avoid his ignorance on this matter, then he's blameless for his ignorance. And if he blamelessly sees no reason to refrain from his slaveholding, then it's unreasonable to expect him to avoid that. And so while we can correctly say that what he does is morally horrific, he would nevertheless be blameless for it. And we could also see how this sort of view would explain our judgments about the two variations on the arsenic case, right? So in the first variation, someone like Matt secretly switched my arsenic and sugar jars. And so supposing that I had no reason to expect that this would happen, it's unreasonable to have expected me to avoid my ignorance, and thus also unreasonable to expect me to have avoided putting arsenic in your tea. So I'm blameless for my ignorance and thus also blameless for acting from that ignorance. And in the second variation on the case, I could have avoided my ignorance just by labeling my sugar and arsenic jars, right? Something I either did realize or easily could have realized that I ought to do. So in that case, it is reasonable to expect me to have taken those steps to thereby have avoided my ignorance and to thereby have avoided acting from that ignorance. And so I'm not excused in that variation. So that's the reasonable expectation approach. The second position on why blameless ignorance excuses focuses on the underlying attitudes that are expressed or reflected in one's beliefs or behavior. So this view of responsibility is sometimes called attributionism, although the name is a little bit controversial. Right? We might even more broadly refer to views like these as quality of will views. In any case, we could put the general idea roughly like this: that an agent is blameworthy for something if and only if that thing reflects a morally objectionable attitude or judgment. So, for example, perhaps it's unreasonable to expect the ancient slaveholder to realize the wrongness of his slaveholding. But of course, that doesn't preclude his behavior from reflecting ill will or lack of due regard towards others, right? Reflecting, the judgment, for example, that his slaves aren't deserving of equal moral consideration. And so as long as that's true on this view, he's blameworthy for what he does. So on this view, on this sort of attributionist or quality of will account, ignorance excuses only when that ignorance precludes those sorts of morally objectionable attitudes or judgments from being expressed in one's behavior. So in the first variation of the arsenic case, where Matt secretly switched my sugar and arsenic jars, my putting the arsenic in your tea isn't the result of any lack of care for you or ill will towards you, right? Neither my ignorance nor my action performed from that ignorance implicates any morally objectionable attitude on my part. But in the second variation, my ignorance itself is the result of a lack of due regard for the well-being of others, right? I just can't be bothered to label my jars, right? Even when I might recognize the risk that it poses to others. So in that case, my ignorance doesn't excuse me. Right? So each of these views has different ways or different way of explaining what we'd want to say about those sorts of cases. And I'll just add one last point that I think will be relevant in the conversation as we move forward, is that one important difference between these two general views is that attributionists maintain that we can be directly responsible and blameworthy for our ignorance itself, whereas the reasonable expectation view, or at least most views that fall into that camp, would maintain that we can only be indirectly responsible and blameworthy for our ignorance in virtue of being responsible for something that led to it. And that's something we can talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you have a view on which of these approaches is better? I have a suspicion, but I wondered if you wanted to say.
Yeah, I'm sure you know. I side with the reasonable expectation view. It's too much to get into in detail here, but I think that voluntary control, the sort of control that we typically take ourselves to have over our actions, is required for responsibility. So I reject attributionism. Going into detail about all the reasons is would take us too far afield. But to put it briefly, I think attributionist views have trouble with certain kinds of manipulation cases and also with preserving the distinction between badness and blameworthiness. But again, this debate is probably worth its own episode. So, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah.
Cool.
Very cool. This is a good segue from what you said at the end there, and how it relates to tracing. So we've been talking in a general way about the connection between moral responsibility and what agents know or believe. But one specific issue that you've written about is the epistemic condition and its relationship to tracing. So First, can you explain what tracing is?
Yeah, sure. So sometimes agents seem responsible for their behavior, even though they don't, at the time of that behavior, satisfy what we might think of as the standard control or epistemic conditions on responsibility. So I'll offer two cases, right? So first, take a drunk driver who hits and kills a child because in his drunken state, he doesn't have the reaction time to swerve quickly enough to avoid, hitting the child. So at the time of his hitting the child, he doesn't seem to have the requisite control over what he's doing in order to be responsible for it. But of course, we would still judge him to be responsible. Or take another case. Take a doctor who ignorantly prescribes medicine to a patient that the patient is allergic to. Now, given his ignorance of the patient's allergy, the doctor doesn't seem to have the requisite awareness concerning his action to be responsible for it. But again, depending upon the details of the case, we might judge him to be responsible anyway. And so the tracing strategy, as it's called, is a way of explaining how we can account for the responsibility of agents in cases like these ones. And the basic idea is this: an agent might be responsible for something, an action, for example, even though the agent doesn't at that time satisfy the standard conditions on responsibility, because that item, that thing, is the consequence of some earlier failure for which the agent is responsible. So the drunk driver can be responsible for hitting the child in virtue of the fact that he's responsible for getting drunk earlier that night and maybe not giving away his car keys to someone else. The ignorant doctor might be responsible for prescribing medication that their patient is allergic to because perhaps the doctor failed to check the patient's medical history before prescribing the medication, and maybe they're responsible for that failure. And so here's where the tracing strategy makes a helpful distinction. Since these agents don't satisfy the standard control or epistemic requirements on responsibility during the time of their actions, we would say that the responsibility for these actions is indirect or derivative. It's rooted in, or it's based on, or it can be traced back to some earlier item for which they're responsible. So this can get a little bit complicated, right? Because it might be possible that the earlier item that it traces back to is also something that the agent is only derivatively responsible for. So maybe the doctor didn't check the patient's medical history because he was completely exhausted. Maybe he didn't sleep at all the night before. But it's usually assumed that, at least at some point in the past, there needs to be something for which the agent is directly responsible. It's usually assumed that an agent is derivatively responsible for some item only if the agent is directly responsible for some earlier item that it resulted in. So perhaps the doctor unwittingly prescribed the medicine because he was too tired to remember to check the patient's medical history. But maybe that's because he stayed up all night watching YouTube videos, or even though he was aware that doing so would compromise his ability to do his job well the following day. Okay, so far I pointed out that the tracing strategy places a necessary condition on derivative or indirect responsibility and blameworthiness, or more generally, responsibility and blameworthiness for consequences. And that is that an agent is derivatively responsible or blameworthy for something only if that's a consequence of some earlier item for which they're responsible. But that's not sufficient for tracing. It's not sufficient for responsibility for consequences. So not just anything that a blameworthy action or omission results in is something for which the agent is thereby also blameworthy. It has to also be the case that there's some sort of cognitive or epistemic connection between the earlier item and the subsequent consequence that results from it. And so some theorists think that this additional condition is that the consequence has to be reasonably foreseeable for the agent at the time of the earlier action. So, for example, it was reasonably foreseeable, perhaps, for the doctor that staying up all night watching YouTube videos might result in a compromised mental state the next day, right? A state that would risk harm to their patients.
Nice. That is a nice segue to our next question. One debate about tracing, and this is one that you're a contributor to, you've published several papers on this, is the debate about whether tracing requires that an agent actually have foreseen some outcome of their behavior, or only that the consequences of that behavior were reasonably foreseeable. Could you say a little bit more about that debate, the positions in it, and what exactly people in that debate disagree about?
Sure. So one might think, as you said, that foreseeability isn't enough. So maybe in order for an agent to be derivatively responsible for something, it has to have been actually foreseen by the agent at some earlier time. And so just one thing that's worth noting before we continue is that this debate over different sorts of ways of parsing out the tracing strategy is a debate that takes place primarily among reasonable expectation theorists, right? Theorists who focus on whether a person's abilities and opportunities make it reasonable to expect them to avoid wrongdoing or ignorance. Okay, so we can first begin by the obvious difference between foreseeability views and actual foresight views, what I call. Foreseeability views imply that someone can be blameworthy for a consequence that they haven't actually foreseen. And there's something to this, right? There are cases in which someone might try to excuse themselves for bringing about some bad consequence. They might say something like, "I didn't realize that this would happen. I didn't know that this would happen." And oftentimes we'll respond to excuses or maybe attempts at excuses by saying things like, "Well, you should have known, right? You should have thought about what you were doing. Like, what were you thinking?" And I think we offer these sorts of responses when we think that, at least in some general sense, the person really could have known or they could have come to realize that acting in that sort of way might result in that sort of bad outcome. In other words, we think that agents ought to foresee the morally relevant consequences of their behavior when those consequences are reasonably foreseeable for them. And so this is a way to understand the reasonable foreseeability view. Suppose that the agent is blameworthy for the action itself, then the agent is also blameworthy for bringing about some bad consequence if the agent could have foreseen it. And that's so even if the agent didn't actually foresee it. The actual foresight view, as I call it, on the other hand, says that even if the consequence was foreseeable for the agent, that doesn't automatically settle whether the agent is blameworthy for bringing about that consequence. And that in addition, the consequence must also have been actually foreseen. Even if it's only foreseen in some general way, the acting now might bring about some type of harm in the future. So the foreseeability view is the standard one in the literature, I think, by far. And theorists that I think fall into this camp often go back and forth between expressing that sort of view, both in terms of what was reasonably foreseeable for an agent, and then sometimes in terms of what the agent should have or ought to have known or foreseen. And while those aren't quite the same thing, they'll often overlap, since you might think that one should or ought to foresee the morally relevant consequences of one's actions that are reasonably foreseeable.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a quick follow-up here? So maybe could you go back to either the drunk driver or the doctor prescribing the medicine cases and say, it seems like both views in this debate might get the same result. They might say, yeah, this outcome not only was reasonably foreseeable, but at least in some general way was actually foreseen. And maybe could you describe a case where it looks like the outcome was reasonably foreseeable but not actually foreseen, just to highlight the difference between the positions?
Yeah, I guess we could think about the case with the doctor, and we could say, I offered a couple variations on that case, but suppose that the doctor's ignorant that what they're prescribing their patient is something that they're allergic to because they failed to check the patient's medical charts. Now, what we have to do then is trace their response, if they are responsible for the harm that they bring their patient or for acting in that sort of ignorant way at that moment. We have to trace it back to an earlier moment, an earlier time. So perhaps we trace it back to, or we try to trace it back to, the failure to check the medical charts. Now, it may or may not occur to them when they're not checking the medical charts that failing to do so might result in that sort of harmful consequence. That it might result in them acting ignorantly. And so, maybe they're having a busy day, or maybe they're in such a rush that it just doesn't even occur to them that not checking the medical charts might result in harm to the patient. They might just be thinking to themselves something like, "Look, I just don't have time for, I have all these patients waiting. I don't have time for this right now." They might not be thinking, if I don't check these charts right now, I might end up being ignorant of something I ought to know, and therefore, right, acting in a way that would harm one of my patients. So, if you think that actual foresight is required, then then if the doctor is not thinking that at the time, there's sort of two routes to go. You could say, well, maybe he knows this, but in some sort of non-occurrent way, in some dispositional way. He knows it, but just not occurring to him at the time. Maybe he's not consciously thinking of it or consciously attending to it.
Yeah.
Or you might think that actual foresight requires consciously attending to something, in which case what you'd have to do is trace it back to some earlier failure. Like maybe some earlier action where they recognize that not checking a patient's charts would develop a sort of bad habit of not checking charts in the future, which and in turn might result in these sorts of harms. So I think that's one way. I mean, we could talk more about this sort of thing in the future.
Yeah.
So you've argued that proponents of the reasonable foreseeability view face a challenge. So what's the worry for that view, and how do you think it should be addressed?
Yeah, I have a paper in Philosophical Studies that's called Reasonable Foreseability and Blameless Ignorance. That's where I offer this argument. And so we can start from what I called the blameless ignorance principle earlier in the interview. And so that principle states that if an agent is blameless for the ignorance from which they act, then they're blameless for acting from that ignorance. So I think that if the blameless ignorance principle is true, then so is a parallel principle about blameless ignorance of the consequences of one's actions. And so we can put the parallel principle like this. If one is blameless for failing to foresee that one's action will or might result in some morally bad consequence, then one is blameless for bringing about that consequence. So we can just call this the blameless ignorance principle for consequences. So someone might be blameworthy for performing some action, and yet they might nevertheless fail to foresee a certain morally bad consequence of that action. And so that parallel principle that I just introduced would imply that if that's the case, then even if the agent is blameworthy for performing the action, they might nevertheless be blameless for bringing about a bad consequence of that action. And whether that's the case will depend upon whether the agent is blameless for failing to foresee that consequence. So we can have, another case with a different doctor. So maybe this will help also clarify some of the differences between the actual foresight views and reasonable foreseeability views. So suppose that this doctor does check their patient's medical history, and that indicates that the patient is allergic to some chemical, call it chemical X. The doctor then prescribes a medication to the patient, while aware that the medication they're prescribing is composed of chemicals alpha, beta, and gamma. And suppose that, as it turns out, chemical gamma is just another name for chemical X, right? The chemical that the patient is allergic to. Now, we can suppose that the doctor knows that these are two names for the same chemical. Maybe he's learned this in medical school. And maybe if you asked him, like, hey, is chemical gamma, is that the same as chemical X? He might pause for a moment and say, yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're the same chemical. But suppose that it just doesn't occur to him at the time. And so he prescribes the medication, and the patient takes it and has an allergic reaction. So we can spell out the details of the case so that it's uncontroversial that the doctor is blameworthy for prescribing the medication. So maybe the doctor knows that the medication is more costly than some equally effective, generic alternative, and that the doctor prescribes it anyway from some ulterior motive. And so he's blameworthy for that action. But that doesn't settle whether he's also blameworthy for the bad consequence, right? The patient's allergic reaction to the medication. Now, it seems pretty clear that it was reasonably foreseeable for the doctor at the time that the medication would result in harm to the patient. Right? The doctor has the knowledge, has the general capacity required to make the relevant inferences here. Right? The inference is that since the patient is allergic to chemical X, and since the medication rather is partly composed of chemical gamma, which is identical to chemical X, that therefore the medication will result in harm to the patient. And so the reasonable foreseeability view implies that the doctor is blameworthy for the consequence. And here the foreseeability theorist might say, look, the doctor should have known, he should have foreseen that prescribing the medication would result in an allergic reaction. Okay, so far so good. But we need to get clearer on what it means to say that someone should know or should be aware of something. Theorists writing on this topic generally agree that epistemic obligations to believe or to know or to be aware of something, really amount to obligations to do certain things, right? To take certain steps, to become aware or to avoid ignorance of something, right? To direct your attention in certain ways, to ask the right questions, to reflect upon the relevant considerations of the situation, maybe in some cases to investigate some matter further, and so on. Gideon Rosen calls these sorts of obligations procedural epistemic obligations. So they're not simply obligations to believe or to be aware of something. They're obligations to do things that make awareness more likely. They're sort of like obligations to do one's due diligence with respect to morality. Okay, so back to the doctor. If the doctor ought to have foreseen the consequence in this case, then that would amount to his having had certain procedural epistemic obligations. For example, he had an obligation to check the patient's medical history before prescribing the medicine. But he did that. And he nevertheless failed to foresee that the medication would result in harm to the patient. Now, of course, there might be additional procedural epistemic obligations that the doctor had. Right? Obligations maybe to pause, to think about the chemical components of the medication he was prescribing, and whether each one might result in harm to the patient. Or perhaps the doctor has more specific obligations, not just to think about these things casually, but maybe to think about them carefully. But in any case, we can suppose that he's done these things. And here's really the point. The point is, even though the purpose of fulfilling these sorts of procedural epistemic obligations is to become aware of morally relevant facts, nothing about the fulfillment of these obligations guarantees that one will become aware of the relevant fact, right? In this case, the fact that the medication will harm the patient. Okay, so if that's right, then it's possible for an agent to fulfill all of their procedural epistemic obligations without thereby becoming aware of the morally relevant consequence. But if an agent does this and nevertheless remains ignorant of that consequence, then they're not blameworthy for their ignorance. After all, they can't be directly blameworthy for their ignorance. That's not something under their direct control. But neither can they be indirectly blameworthy for their ignorance, since that would require being blameworthy for some earlier failure, like a failure to fulfill one of their procedural epistemic obligations. And the doctor, as we've stipulated, hasn't failed in that regard. Okay, so I'll wrap up here. This sort of agent then would be blameless for failing to foresee what they ought to have foreseen, blameless for failing to foresee what was reasonably foreseeable for them. So then just recall that parallel principle that I introduced, right? If one is blameless for failing to foresee that one's action might result in some morally bad consequence, then one is blameless for bringing about that consequence. So this means that it's possible for someone to be blameless for a morally bad and foreseeable consequence of an earlier blameworthy action. But if that's true, then foreseeability views are false. They maintain that the agents are blameworthy for morally bad and foreseeable consequences of earlier blameworthy actions. So I think that given some plausible assumptions that are at work in the argument, the epistemic condition on tracing should actually be understood in terms of actual foresight and not reasonable foreseeability.
Interesting. Nice. That's a cool argument. So you just mentioned that the argument does depend on certain assumptions. So could you talk really for a few minutes about what some of those assumptions are, how someone might avoid the conclusion of your argument by rejecting one or more of those assumptions?
Right, yeah. So one of the assumptions is that we can't be directly blameworthy for ignorance. And if that's true, if we can't be directly blameworthy for ignorance, then we're blameworthy for ignorance only if we're blameworthy for some earlier failure to fulfill some procedural epistemic obligation. But I mean, if we reject this assumption, then, for example, the doctor might be blameworthy for failing to foresee that the medication would harm his patient, even if the doctor isn't blameworthy for any earlier failure to fulfill their procedural epistemic obligations. And so then the doctor might very well be blameworthy for the harmful consequence. But again, this assumption that we can't be directly blameworthy for ignorance is generally shared by foreseeability theorists. It's actually one of the reasons they adopt the tracing strategy to begin with, to explain how we can be responsible and blameworthy for things that aren't under our control, things like ignorance.
Right.
So I don't think that they would reject that. Another assumption is the blameless ignorance principle, that we're blameworthy for acting from ignorance only if we're blameworthy for the ignorance from which we act. So I mean, if this principle is false, right, if blameless ignorance doesn't excuse, then it doesn't excuse for ignorance of the consequences of one's behavior. And then my parallel principle about blameless ignorance of consequences doesn't even get off the ground. But again, nearly all theorists in the literature agree on the blameless ignorance principle, or at least a version of it that would apply in this case. I don't want to get too complicated, but at least insofar as it applies here. And the last assumption is that parallel principle that I introduced, the blameless ignorance principle for consequences. If one rejects this, then an agent can be blameworthy for some bad consequence, even if they're blamelessly ignorant of it. But the thing here is that I think that if one already accepts the original blameless ignorance principle, I just don't see any principled reason that they'd have to reject this parallel principle. So those are the main assumptions of the argument. And right here's the thing. Foreseeability theorists accept the first two assumptions generally, and they at least seem to have no principled reason to deny the third assumption. So that's sort of the challenge.
Nice.
Yeah. All right, so here's a follow-up question. Your argument specifically focused on different versions of the tracing strategy. So are there any implications for responsibility and ignorance more generally?
Yeah, well, we can start by noticing that there are going to be fewer cases in which a consequence is actually foreseen than there are cases in which a consequence is foreseeable. So if actual foresight is required for blameworthiness for consequences, then that would mean that we're less often blameworthy for the consequences of our actions and omissions. And in particular, it'll mean that we're less often blameworthy for our ignorance. So there will be cases in which ignorance of some morally relevant fact is not an actually foreseen consequence of any earlier action or omission of ours. There's no point in the past that you could trace it back to where, the agent actually saw that what they were doing then might result in subsequent ignorance. And so if the argument works, then we wouldn't be blameworthy for our ignorance in those sorts of cases. And if blameless ignorance excuses, as most people would agree, then we're less often blameworthy for ignorant wrongdoing than we might normally think. And I think that we're often inclined to blame people for their ignorant wrongdoing when we think that they should have known better. But if the argument works, then the fact that they should have known better just doesn't immediately imply that they're to blame for not knowing better. So if actual foresight is required for tracing, if that's the right way to think about the tracing strategy, then we might have to revise many of our common sense judgments of blameworthiness for ignorant wrongdoing.
Fascinating. Well, you mentioned Gideon Rosen earlier, and I think he's one of these philosophers. Some philosophers think that upon reflecting on these issues, we should actually be skeptical about whether we're ever justified in believing that someone is blameworthy. Could you explain how this sort of argument works and how it's related to the epistemic condition?
Yeah, the argument's a little bit complicated, and anyone who's interested should definitely check out Gideon Rosen's paper. It's called Skepticism About Moral Responsibility. And just to give credit where credit's due, another earlier argument that gets pretty close to the same sort of conclusion is Michael Zimmerman's paper, Moral Responsibility and Ignorance. So I'll just present an abridged version of Rosen's skeptical argument here. And one thing that's helpful is I'll start partway through the argument because a lot of the assumptions that get him there are assumptions that are shared with the argument that I offered. So a lot of the assumptions of my argument overlap with assumptions that, or at least premises in Rosen's skeptical argument. And so here's how it goes, again, the shortened version. All responsibility for ignorance or for ignorant wrongdoing is derivative. And so ultimately, responsibility for these things has to be traced back to something for which an agent is directly responsible. But here, Rosen maintains that an agent is directly responsible for something only when it's not performed from any kind of ignorance. So in the case of a morally wrong action, the agent would need to, one, be aware of the morally relevant features of their action, two, that those features make the action morally wrong, and then perhaps even third, that all things considered, that they ought not perform the action. So in other words, on Rosen's view, according to this argument, all responsibility would ultimately have to be rooted or traced back to what philosophers call acratic action that is contrary to our all things considered judgment about what we ought to do. And then here's where Rosen adds a crucial premise. He says, on any particular occasion, we can never be justifiably confident, either for others or for ourselves, whether someone has in fact acted acratically. So for example, maybe I believe that I shouldn't tell a certain lie. But then when I find myself in the moment, right, I find a way to convince myself that lying on that occasion is justified, right? After all, it's only a white lie, and what the other person doesn't know can't really hurt them, and so on. Right? So maybe I end up acting, but I'm not acting acratically because I've changed my mind. I now believe that it's permissible to do what I'm doing. There might also be cases in which we might hold a judgment about what we ought to do, but that judgment might not be explicit, right? It might not even be consciously thought of at the time. And so then it might not be clear, even to oneself, what one believed about an action, at the time that one was performing it. So Rosen thinks that on any particular occasion, we're not going to be justified in believing that someone has acted acratically. And if all responsibility ultimately has to be rooted in or traced back to acratic action, then we're never justified on any particular occasion in believing that someone is responsible or blameworthy for something. So that's sort of the short version.
Nice.
Yeah. So what's your assessment of this kind of argument?
Yeah. So luckily, I think there's a way to resist the conclusion. And of course, when it comes to skeptical arguments, the question is almost always, which premise or premises should we reject? A number of authors have objected to different premises in the argument. But I think to keep it simple, there's at least one premise that we have good reason to reject. And I think we should reject the premise that I just discussed. The premise that we're never justified in believing that someone, ourselves included, has acted acratically. And here I'll just give credit again to William Fitzpatrick. William Fitzpatrick has done a really nice job of explaining why we should reject that premise. He has a paper called Moral Responsibility and Normative Ignorance, Answering a New Skeptical Challenge, where he engages with Rosen's argument. So Fitzpatrick argues that we have plenty of good first-hand evidence that at least we sometimes act acratically. So for example, when we feel guilt or shame, not just after we've done something, but while we're doing it, right? That's pretty good evidence that at the time of the action, we judge that we shouldn't be doing what we're doing. So that's the sort of feeling you might have, right? If you're behaving deceptively or sneaking around or, looking over your shoulder, as it were, while you're doing something. That's pretty good evidence that you believe that you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. And in a similar way, we have good evidence that other people sometimes act acratically, right? So for example, they might openly acknowledge having known better at the time and having felt guilty or shameful while they were acting. He also points out that when someone tries to conceal their behavior, that can be good evidence that they believed at the time that they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. So if we can reject that premise in the argument, the premise that we can never be justified in believing that someone has acted acratically, then we could avoid the skeptical conclusion of the argument. And so in the end, I think I fall somewhere in between the skeptic like Rosen on the one hand, and on the other hand, those who think that we're often responsible for ignorant behavior and its outcomes. So I think that we're sometimes responsible and blameworthy for our behavior, even our ignorant behavior, but perhaps significantly less often, or at least to a lesser degree than we might ordinarily take ourselves to be.
Nice. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and wrap up. Thanks so much for joining us, Dan. Where can listeners who are interested in following your work go to find what you're doing?
Thanks so much for having me on. This is great. You can go to my website at danieljamesmiller.com, or else they can just look up my profile on philpeople.org.
Cool. Yeah, thanks again. In our next episode, we will talk with Andrew Latham and Hannah Tierney about their recent collaborative work on manipulation arguments against compatibilism.